They say the smallest choices can change a life. Mine cost me my last $5. The coffee had gone cold in my hands long before I reached the corner of 47th Street and Lexington Avenue. A sharp October wind funneled between the buildings, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust through the morning rush. New York was already awake, impatient and loud, everyone moving like they had somewhere important to be. I checked the time on my phone and sighed. 7:43. My shift at Bellissimo Italian Grill started in 17 minutes, and I was still 6 blocks away. Not exactly ideal when your manager already thought you were one late arrival away from being fired. I tightened my grip on the paper cup and picked up my pace. The soles of my shoes were worn thin, and every crack in the sidewalk seemed determined to remind me. Rent was due in 5 days. Mom's medication refill was due in 3. My tuition payment was already 2 weeks late. Some mornings, it felt like my entire life existed one unexpected expense away from falling apart. That was why I almost kept walking when I saw him. Almost. The elderly man sat alone beside the entrance to a closed bookstore, wrapped in a faded green army jacket that looked 20 years older than he was. His hands trembled around a cardboard sign. The words were simple. Hungry. Anything helps. Most people never even looked at him. They passed by without slowing down, eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to notice. I understood why. New York taught people how to ignore things. It was practically a survival skill. But something about him made me stop. Maybe it was the way he stared at the ground instead of asking for money. Maybe it was because he looked tired in the same way my mother looked tired after a long day. Or maybe it was because kindness had always been easier for me than walking away. I crouched beside him. "Have you eaten today?" I asked. He looked surprised that someone had spoken to him. "Not yet." His voice was rough. I glanced down at the coffee in my hand, then at the $5 bill folded inside my wallet. The last cash I had until payday. Logic told me to keep it. Responsibility told me to keep it. My bank account practically begged me to keep it. Instead, I stood and crossed the street to a small deli. 5 minutes later, I returned carrying a hot breakfast sandwich and a fresh cup of coffee. The old man stared at them like I'd handed him a winning lottery ticket. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. I smiled. "I know." His eyes watered slightly as he accepted the food. "Thank you." I nodded and turned to leave before the gratitude made me emotional. That was when I noticed the black SUV parked across the street. It was impossible not to notice. The vehicle looked expensive enough to buy my entire apartment building. Tinted windows, immaculate paint, engine running. For a second, I thought I saw someone sitting inside watching us. Then a horn sounded behind me, snapping me back to reality. I shook off the feeling and hurried toward work. I never looked back. If I had, I would have seen the man inside that SUV lower the newspaper in his hands. I would have seen him watching me walk away. And I would have seen something shift in the eyes of Dominic Moretti, a man who had spent years believing everything in the world had a price. The dinner rush always sounded the same. Clattering dishes, conversations blending together, the hiss of the espresso machine, the occasional shout from the kitchen when an order was running late. By 6 o'clock, Bellissimo Italian Grill was packed wall to wall, and I was moving on pure muscle memory. Smile. Take orders. Refill drinks. Deliver food. Repeat. It was not glamorous, but it paid the bills. At least most of them. I balanced a tray of sparkling water glasses against one shoulder and made my way through the crowded dining room. The warm scent of garlic and fresh bread filled the air. My feet already ached, and I still had 4 hours left in my shift. Table 14 needs menus, my manager called from across the room. And the VIP room just arrived. I nodded automatically. The VIP room. Everyone at Bellissimo knew about it. Wealthy clients, business executives, professional athletes, people who could spend more on a single dinner than I spent on groceries in a month. Most servers fought over those tables because the tips were incredible. Personally, I preferred regular customers. They usually asked fewer questions and expected less performance. I grabbed a stack of menus and pushed through the swinging doors. The private room sat at the back of the restaurant behind dark glass panels. As soon as I entered, the atmosphere felt different. Quieter, more controlled. For men sat around the large table, all dressed in expensive suits. Their watches probably cost more than my car. The man seated at the head of the table looked familiar, though I could not immediately place why. Dark hair, broad shoulders, calm expression. He sat completely still while the others talked around him. Then I recognized him. The black SUV from that morning. My stomach tightened slightly. Not because he looked dangerous. Because there was something unusual about the way he watched the room. Like he noticed everything. "Good evening," I said. "Can I start anyone with drinks?" The men exchanged glances. One ordered wine. Another asked for sparkling water. The dark-haired man finally looked up from the menu. His eyes met mine for a brief second. "Black coffee," he said. His voice was low and steady. Nothing else. I wrote it down. Coming right up. That was it. No flirting. No nervousness. No attempt to impress him. He was a customer. I was a waitress. End of story. Or so I thought. Throughout the evening, I noticed something strange. Every time I entered the room, one of the other servers found an excuse to linger nearby. They straightened their hair, smiled a little brighter, laughed a little louder. One even asked if the man at the head of the table was single. I had no idea. And honestly, I did not care. Rent did not become cheaper because a customer was attractive. Nursing school did not become easier because a customer owned an expensive suit. Real life had a way of keeping priorities clear. Around 8:30, I returned with fresh coffee. As I placed the cup beside him, the conversation at the table stopped for a moment. The dark-haired man looked at me again. Not at my uniform. Not at my appearance. Just at me. "Long day?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I glanced at the stack of plates balanced on my arm and smiled faintly. "Aren't they all?" Something unexpected flickered in his expression. Almost amusement. Almost respect. Then the moment passed. I turned and walked away without realizing that every person at that table was now watching me for an entirely different reason. The smell of fresh rain drifted through the restaurant's front doors every time a customer entered, carrying a cool breeze that felt almost refreshing after hours spent weaving through a crowded dining room. By the time my shift finally ended, my legs felt like concrete. I tied my apron strings loose and headed toward the employee station to clock out. That was when Marco appeared beside me holding a black leather folder. "VIP room left this behind," he said. "Can you run outside and see if they are still here?" I glanced at the folder. It looked expensive. Everything connected to those men looked expensive. Sure. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and immediately spotted the group across the street near a row of black vehicles. The city lights reflected off polished paint and dark windows. They looked like men who belonged in a different world from mine. I jogged across the crosswalk, holding the folder against my chest. "Excuse me." One of the suited men turned first. Then the others followed. The dark-haired man from the head of the table looked directly at me. "You left this." I held out the folder. For a second, nobody moved. Then one of the men stepped forward and took it from my hands. He opened it immediately. His eyebrows lifted. Another man looked inside. Then another. Their expressions shifted in a way I could not quite understand. The dark-haired man remained silent. "Everything is there," one of them finally said. I blinked. Was something supposed to be missing? The men exchanged glances. The dark-haired man stepped forward. "Do you know what was inside?" he asked. "No. You never checked?" I almost laughed. Why would I? A strange silence followed. The city traffic hummed around us. Somewhere down the block, a siren echoed briefly before fading away. The man studied me carefully. Most people would have looked. Maybe. I shrugged. It was not mine. Something flickered in his eyes again. That same expression from earlier. Not surprise exactly. More like curiosity. As if I had answered a question he had been asking himself. One of the other men cleared his throat. "Miss, do you know how much cash was in that envelope?" I shook my head. "No. $20,000. For a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. $20,000. More money than I had ever seen in one place in my entire life. More than enough to cover my tuition, my mother's medical bills, several months of rent. The number hit me like cold water, but only for a second. Then I shrugged again. Well, I guess somebody would have been upset if it got lost. One of the men actually laughed. The sound seemed to surprise everyone, including himself. The dark-haired man never looked away from me. "What is your name?" he asked. "Emily Carter." "Emily." He said it slowly, like he was committing it to memory. Then he extended his hand. "Dominic Moretti." I shook it briefly. His grip was firm but respectful. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Moretti." "Dominic is fine." I smiled politely. "Good night, Dominic." Then I turned and walked back toward the restaurant without another thought. I did not see the men staring after me. I did not hear one of them quietly say, "Boss, nobody walks away from $20,000. And I definitely did not hear Dominic's answer. That is exactly why she interests me. 3 days passed before I thought about Dominic Moretti again. And even then it was only because I found myself standing in line at the grocery store calculating whether I could afford strawberries this week. The answer was no. I put them back and reached for a cheaper bag of apples instead. That was my life. Constant math. Every dollar had a purpose before it even entered my wallet. Every expense competed with another. By the time I carried the grocery bags up the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment, my arms were aching. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and somebody's overcooked dinner. Home. Not glamorous, but ours. I unlocked the door and immediately heard my mother's voice from the living room. Emily, is that you? Who else would carry enough groceries to feed a small army? I called back. Her laughter floated down the hallway. It was worth more than anything I could have bought. I found her sitting beneath a blanket with a library book resting on her lap. The lamp beside her cast a warm glow across the room. The apartment was small. The furniture did not match. The wallpaper was peeling near one corner of the ceiling. But it felt safe. That mattered. You look tired, Mom said. I am tired. Then sit down for 5 minutes. I smiled and dropped onto the couch beside her. 5 minutes turned into 20. We talked about everything and nothing. Her doctor's appointment next week. My nursing classes. The neighbor's dog that barked every morning at exactly 6 o'clock. Normal things. The kind of things that made difficult lives feel manageable. The next morning started before sunrise. By 7:30, I was attending lectures. By noon, I was studying anatomy. By 4, I was back at Bellissimo carrying trays through crowded aisles. It was exhausting. But every step brought me closer to the future I wanted. What I did not know was that somebody had started paying attention. Not in a way that felt threatening. Not in a way that disrupted my life. More like a distant observer trying to solve a puzzle. Dominic learned that I worked 2 jobs. He learned that I attended nursing school. He learned that every Thursday evening I stopped at the same pharmacy to pick up medication for my mother. He learned that I volunteered twice a month at a community food pantry despite barely having enough free time for myself. The more he learned, the less sense I made to him. Most people wanted something. Money, influence, opportunity, favor. Everyone seemed to be chasing an advantage. Yet every report came back with the same conclusion. Emily Carter helped people whenever she could and asked for nothing in return. One rainy Friday evening, I left the restaurant carrying a worn backpack and an umbrella that barely worked. Across the street, a black SUV sat parked beneath the glow of a streetlight. I never noticed it. I hurried toward the subway entrance instead, trying to avoid puddles. Through the tinted window, Dominic watched me disappear into the crowd. One of his associates sat beside him. I still do not understand it, the man admitted. Dominic remained silent for several seconds. His eyes followed the place where I had vanished. Finally he spoke. Neither do I. And for the first time in years, that uncertainty did not frustrate him. It fascinated him. The alarm on my phone went off at 5:15 in the morning, long before the sun reached the windows of our apartment. For a moment, I lay still beneath my blanket, listening to the old radiator click and hum somewhere in the building. Every muscle in my body felt heavy, the kind of exhaustion that settled into your bones and stayed there. But staying in bed was not an option. It never was. I rolled onto my side, checked my bank account, and immediately regretted it. The numbers stared back at me like a bad joke. After rent, tuition, groceries, and Mom's medication, there was barely enough left to make it through the month. I closed the app and sat up. Worry would not pay the bills. Work might. By 7 o'clock, I was attending class with a notebook balanced on my lap and a cup of gas station coffee beside me. By noon, I was reviewing patient care procedures. By 3 o'clock, I was stocking shelves at a small pharmacy where I worked part-time twice a week. By 6 o'clock, I was back at Bellissimo carrying trays through another busy dinner rush. Most days blurred together. Work, school, home, repeat. Yet somehow I still found room for other people. On Tuesday afternoon, I spent my lunch break helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries upstairs because her elevator was broken. On Wednesday, I stayed after class to help another student prepare for an exam she was terrified of failing. On Thursday, I volunteered at the food pantry even though I desperately needed the extra hours to study. My friends called me stubborn. Mom called me kind. I was not sure which one was more accurate. The truth was simple. I knew what it felt like to struggle. And once you understood that feeling, it became harder to ignore it in someone else. One rainy evening, I left the pharmacy carrying a paper bag filled with medication. The rain had started unexpectedly, turning the sidewalks silver beneath the streetlights. I opened my umbrella and hurried toward the bus stop. Halfway there, I noticed a young woman standing beneath an awning with a crying little boy. The child could not have been older than 6. Their bus had already left. The woman looked exhausted. The boy looked miserable. Without thinking, I walked over and handed them my umbrella. "Take it," I said. The woman immediately shook her head. "I cannot." "You can. I live close by." It was not entirely true. My apartment was almost a mile away, but they did not need to know that. The little boy looked up at me through wet hair. "Really?" I smiled. "Really?" They thanked me 3 times before leaving. I watched them disappear down the street before pulling my hood over my head and starting the long walk home through the rain. The next morning, in an office overlooking Manhattan, Dominic Moretti sat behind a polished desk while one of his associates finished a report. The associate sounded confused. She gave away her umbrella. Dominic looked up. "What?" "The woman we have been discussing. She walked home in the rain so a stranger and her child would stay dry." Silence settled across the room. The associate flipped through another page. "There is more. She volunteers. She tutors classmates. She helps neighbors. She donates when she barely has enough herself." Dominic leaned back slowly. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched endlessly beneath gray clouds. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something. Money, access, advantage. Yet every new detail about Emily Carter pointed in the opposite direction. Finally he spoke. "And what does she ask for in return?" The associate hesitated. "Nothing." Dominic stared out at the skyline for several long seconds. Then a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Because for the first time in a very long time, he had found something rarer than power. He had found someone who still believed kindness was worth giving away. The wind rattled the subway entrance signs as I climbed the stairs into the cold night air. My shift had ended later than usual, and Manhattan felt different after midnight. The streets were quieter, the crowds thinner, the bright energy of the city replaced by something softer and more reflective. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and started the walk toward the bus stop. My feet hurt. My shoulders hurt. Even my thoughts felt tired. All I wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before class the next morning. A block later, I noticed someone sitting alone on a bench near a closed florist shop. At first I barely looked. New York was full of people sitting alone. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the way the man was leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. Maybe it was the exhaustion written across his posture. Or maybe it was because he reminded me of my mother on difficult days. The streetlight above him flickered softly. He wore a dark coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Nothing about him looked unusual. Just another tired New Yorker trying to make it through the night. I started walking again, then stopped. The coffee shop on the corner was still open. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pushed through the door and bought 2 cups of coffee. 5 minutes later, I returned to the bench. The man looked up as I approached. His eyes narrowed slightly with surprise. "You look like you need this more than I do," I said, holding out one of the cups. For a second, he simply stared at me. Then he accepted it. "Thank you." His voice sounded familiar somehow, but I could not place it. I smiled and sat on the opposite end of the bench. Not close enough to invade his space, just close enough to share the silence. Steam drifted from our coffee cups into the cold air. Cars passed occasionally. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed before fading away. "Rough day?" I asked. A faint laugh escaped him. "Something like that." "Mine too." He glanced toward me. "And yet you bought coffee for a stranger." I shrugged. "Sometimes strangers need it." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. We sat quietly for another minute. It felt strangely comfortable. Easy. Like talking to someone who expected nothing from you. Eventually I stood and adjusted my backpack. "Well, I should get home." He looked up. "You do not even know my name." I laughed softly. "That is true. Dominic." The name hit me a second later. My eyes widened. The coffee. The restaurant. The envelope. The black SUV. He watched realization spread across my face. "Oh." His smile grew slightly. "Oh, I did not recognize you." That was the idea. I shook my head, still surprised. "Well, now I feel embarrassed." "Why?" "Because I was giving life advice to someone who probably owns half the city." For the first time since I had met him, Dominic laughed. A real laugh. Warm and genuine. It completely transformed his face. For a moment, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a regular man who had simply forgotten how to relax. I found myself smiling back. Neither of us noticed the black SUV parked across the street, or the concerned associate sitting inside, because at that moment, something unexpected was happening. Dominic Moretti had spent years protecting his world from everyone else. And without even trying, I had somehow been invited into it. The first snow of the season arrived 2 weeks later, dusting the city in a thin layer of white that melted almost as quickly as it landed. I was leaving campus with a stack of textbooks balanced against my chest when my phone buzzed. The number on the screen belonged to the financial aid office. My stomach immediately tightened. I already knew what the call was about before I answered. Tuition. It was always tuition. By the time the conversation ended, I was standing motionless beneath the gray afternoon sky, barely hearing the traffic around me. A payment deadline had been moved forward. A scholarship application was still pending. If everything did not fall into place soon, I could lose my place in the program for the semester. I thanked the woman on the phone, hung up, and stared at the sidewalk. For the first time in months, I felt overwhelmed. Not tired, not stressed, overwhelmed. There was a difference. The city suddenly seemed louder, colder, larger. I took a slow breath and started walking toward the subway. One step at a time. That was how I handled problems. One step at a time. What I did not know was that someone else had learned about the situation less than an hour earlier. Dominic sat at the long conference table in his office while 3 executives discussed numbers projected across a screen. Normally, he would have been paying attention. Normally, nothing distracted him during meetings. Today was different. His phone rested beside his hand. A short report had arrived that morning. Emily Carter. Tuition issue. Scholarship delayed. Risk of losing enrollment status. The words had followed him all day. Mr. Moretti? One of the executives looked toward him expectantly. Dominic blinked. Continue. The meeting resumed. 5 minutes later, he interrupted it entirely. Reschedule the rest. The room fell silent. The executives exchanged confused looks. Dominic never canceled meetings. Ever. Yet 10 minutes later, he was standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office watching snow drift between skyscrapers. You are worried about her. The observation came from Anthony, the associate who had known him the longest. Dominic did not answer immediately. She works harder than anyone I have ever met, he finally said. And she never complains. Anthony folded his arms. So what are you going to do? Dominic looked out across Manhattan. For years, every problem in his world had been solved with money. But somehow that felt wrong now. Emily had never asked him for anything. That mattered. Nothing she would not accept. Meanwhile, I was sitting at our kitchen table pretending everything was fine. Mom was telling me about a novel she had borrowed from the library. I nodded and smiled at the right moments. But inside, my thoughts kept circling the same question. What if I could not finish school? The fear stayed with me all evening. Then, just before midnight, my email notification chimed. I almost ignored it. Almost. The message came from the Scholarship Foundation. My application status had changed. Hands trembling, I opened it. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Then I read it again. And again. Full scholarship approval. Effective immediately. I could not breathe. I could not think. Relief hit me so hard that tears filled my eyes. Mom looked up from across the room. Emily. I laughed through the tears. I got it. She understood instantly. A second later, we were both crying and laughing at the same time. Neither of us knew that across the city, Dominic Moretti was standing alone in his office looking out at the lights of Manhattan with a rare sense of peace. Because for the first time in years, helping someone mattered more to him than winning. The first thing I noticed was the silence. For the first time in months, I was not lying awake at night calculating tuition payments in my head. The scholarship had changed everything. Not my entire life, but enough to let me breathe again. Enough to let me look beyond the next bill and imagine a future waiting on the other side of graduation. Winter settled over Manhattan in earnest after that. Snow gathered along sidewalks. Holiday lights appeared in storefront windows. The city seemed softer somehow, wrapped in gold reflections and cold air. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Dominic in a small coffee shop near Central Park. It was not fancy. In fact, I was pretty sure he was the richest person who had ever stepped inside the place. Yet he looked surprisingly comfortable there. We had started meeting occasionally over the past few weeks. Sometimes coffee. Sometimes a quick conversation after work. Nothing complicated. Nothing dramatic. Just two people who somehow enjoyed each other's company. You are smiling, he said, stirring his coffee. Am I? You are. I laughed and looked out the window. Children were building a crooked snowman across the street. I guess I am having a good day. Dominic watched me for a moment. You deserve more of those. The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made my chest tighten. Nobody had ever looked at me the way he did. Not with admiration. Not with respect. Most people saw the waitress, the struggling student, the girl constantly rushing between responsibilities. Dominic saw something else, and somehow that mattered more than I wanted to admit. A week later, he invited my mother and me to dinner. I nearly declined. The restaurant was elegant enough to make me nervous. The menu did not even have prices printed on it. But Mom insisted. Emily, it is dinner, not a royal coronation. By the end of the evening, she adored him. Absolutely adored him. I watched in disbelief as Dominic listened patiently to stories about my childhood, asked thoughtful questions, and laughed at jokes that were honestly not that funny. On the drive home, Mom stared out the passenger window for several minutes before speaking. He cares about you. I immediately shook my head. Mom. Emily. We are friends. She smiled knowingly. If that helps you sleep at night. The truth was more complicated. Because somewhere along the way, Dominic had stopped feeling like a wealthy customer from the restaurant. He had stopped feeling like a distant mystery. He felt familiar. Safe. Important. One snowy evening, he showed up outside Bellissimo just as my shift ended. The streetlights reflected off fresh snow. His black coat was dusted with white flakes. What are you doing here? I asked. Waiting. For me? Yes. I laughed softly. You could have called. I know. We started walking side by side through the city. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to reach our destination. Finally, he glanced toward me. Emily, can I ask you something? Of course. His expression grew unusually serious. If you could have anything in the world right now, what would it be? I thought about money. About luxury apartments. About expensive vacations. About all the things people usually dreamed about. Then I shook my head. Honestly, enough time with the people I love. Dominic became very quiet after that, as if I had given an answer he never expected. Because for a man who could buy almost anything, I had just named the one thing money could never guarantee. The city glittered beneath a blanket of fresh snow the night everything finally changed. Christmas lights reflected across store windows. Taxi headlights painted streaks of gold across wet streets. Manhattan looked like a postcard, beautiful and temporary, the kind of beauty people forgot to appreciate until it was gone. I stood beside the large windows of the hospital lobby, watching snowflakes drift through the darkness outside. My final clinical rotation had ended an hour earlier. Graduation was only a few months away now. For the first time in years, the future felt real. My phone buzzed softly. A message from Dominic. Look outside. Confused, I stepped toward the entrance. Across the street, a familiar black SUV sat parked beneath a glowing street lamp. I could not help smiling. Some things never changed. Moments later, I slid into the passenger seat, bringing cold air and melting snow with me. Dominic glanced over. Long day. I laughed. You ask me that every time. And every time the answer is yes. We drove without destination for a while, simply watching the city pass by. Comfortable silence settled between us. Not awkward. Not forced. The kind of silence that only exists when two people genuinely understand each other. Eventually, Dominic parked near the waterfront overlooking the East River. The skyline stretched across the darkness like a field of stars. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he took a slow breath. Do you remember the first time we met? I smiled. The restaurant. No. I frowned. Then where? A faint smile touched his face. A cold morning. An elderly man outside a bookstore. Realization hit me instantly. That was you. He nodded. I was sitting in the SUV across the street. I stared at him in disbelief. You were watching? I was. I laughed softly and shook my head. That is ridiculous. Probably. His smile faded into something more serious. But it was the first time I noticed you. The city lights reflected in his eyes as he looked at me. I spent years believing people were predictable. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had a price. Then you walked into my life and ruined that theory. My heart began beating faster. Dominic rarely spoke about himself. Rarely allowed anyone to see beneath the calm confidence he showed the world. Tonight felt different. Emily, he said quietly, you changed me. I opened my mouth to respond, but he continued. You never asked for money. Never asked for favors. Never cared who I was. You treated me like a person when most people only saw what I could give them. The cold winter air suddenly felt very still. Dominic, he shook his head gently. You did not steal my heart. His voice softened. You reminded me I still had one. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were honest. Completely and undeniably honest. I reached for his hand. He held mine carefully, like something precious. Outside, snow continued falling over the city. Cars moved through the streets below. Millions of lives continued unfolding beneath the glow of Manhattan's lights. But in that quiet moment, none of it mattered. Because sometimes the most extraordinary thing in the world is not power. It is not wealth. It is not influence. Sometimes the most extraordinary thing is finding someone who reminds you who you are when the world has made you forget. And on that winter night, beneath a sky filled with falling snow, both of us finally understood that the smallest acts of kindness can change a life forever.